It's my distinct honor to introduce Dr. Christina Sharpe. Christina Sharpe is a writer, professor, Tier 1 Canada Research Chair in Black Studies in the Humanities at York University in Toronto. She is a senior research associate at the Center for Study of Race, Gender, and Class at the University of Johannesburg. Sharpe is the author of Monstrous Intimacies, Making Post-Slavery Subjects, which was written in 2010, and In the Wake, on Blackness and Being in 2016. In the Wake was named by The Guardian and The Walrus as one of the best books of that year, and it was the nonfiction finalist for the Hurston Wright Legacy Award. Her third book, Ordinary Notes, which was written and published just last year, won the Hillary Weston Writers' Trust Prize in Nonfiction and was a finalist in the National Book Awards in Nonfiction as well. She is currently working on What Could a Vessel Be, which is slated to come out in 2025, as well as Black Still Life, which is slated to come out through Duke University Press in 2025 as well. She's also writing 3 books, oh my goodness, okay. And a third forthcoming book, To Have Been to the End of the World, 25 Essays on Art. Her writing, beyond the published books, have appeared in many artist catalogs such as Dawood Bey Elegy, and as well as in Frieze, Paris Review, Harper's, Bomb Magazine, and the Funabulist, thank you. So with that, please help me welcome Dr. Christina Sharpe.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to try to do several things at once, like make sure I remember to move the slides forward, so bear with me. But first, I want to say, wow. I don't feel like an exclamation point because I feel like today was an exclamation point, and what an honor and a privilege to be part of this convening, and what a beautiful series of talks and conversations. I'm really still sitting with the last 3 conversations, and I will be sitting with them for some time, so thank you so much. And thank you, Valerie, for that warm and wonderful introduction. So, again, it's a pleasure to be with you here to mark Dawood Bey's tremendous work gathered here as elegy. And I want to thank Dawood and Valerie for the invitation to be here with you. If Dawood asks me to do something, if at all possible, I say yes. I want to thank Katie for all of the work that she did to get me here. I want to thank the tech staff, including the person who just switched out a photograph for me, the other museum staff, and all of the people who serve the food and open and close the rooms. Without you, nothing we do is possible. I'm going to read from Ordinary Notes, but because I'm a relentless editor, some of the notes aren't exactly as they appear in the book. And there are 3 additional notes. That's the thing about a published book. You can't keep changing it, but then again, you can. There are also 3 video notes, and those notes are thanks to a collaboration with Khalil Joseph, Onye Anwanyu, and Black News. But first, another short preface. So a bit of an explanatory note. So Ordinary Notes is a series of 248 written notes. There are also visual notes that are photographs, for the most part, that attend to multiple meanings of the words ordinary and note, and what ordinary might mean in a Black life in this moment in the world. So these are notes on encountering the daily, the literary, the visual, violence, the arbitrary, the ordinary, and the beautiful. They're notes on Black life. The book has 8 sections, and the notes are organized by a kind of logic of juxtaposition, accumulation, and encounter. And they're always concerned with what I think of as the ordinary, extraordinary matter of Black life. The name Ordinary Notes, and you'll see this in note 2, but I'll still say, comes from my continued thinking of Toni Morrison's Beloved. And the scene, for those of you who've read Beloved, which I'm guessing is a lot of you, in which Paul D. is held in a slave labor chain gang in Alfred, Georgia. And the man called High Man takes on the responsibility to interrupt the particular violences of the morning. And High Man's daily calls are life-sustaining, ordinary notes of care. That is, they cut through the violence of the surround, and they sound a deep regard for each other, for what can be withstood, for what must be eased, or for what must end. Encounters are central to the book, encounters with books, with people, places, ideas, art, and of course with the past. There's a section of Ordinary Notes called Lucida that reads Roland Barthes' Camera Lucida and asks, what would a Camera Lucida of the Black maternal look like, or be like, or do? There's a section called Preliminary Entries Toward a Dictionary of Untranslatable Blackness, which thinks a series of words from a position in Black life, words like life, tenderness, refusal, archive, regard, and elegance. And that section has definitions that are written by me, but it also brings together definitions written by colleagues and friends who are scholars, poets, artists, writers, and together it forms a kind of choral response to the dictionary that earlier suggests itself. The book closes with a series of photographs. I'm not a photographer, but I have some little snapshots in there. And a painting by the artist Colleen Smith of my mother's hand holding a copy of Beloved. And these notes act as kind of visual notes of what I call beauty every day, and they're the ordinary notes that I also try to make and leave in the world as trace. In the Wake, I wrote that while we Black people are constituted through and by vulnerability to overwhelming force, we are not known only to ourselves and to each other by that force. So Ordinary Notes is my attempt to animate and make present that other register of knowing, one that we might name as regard. Part 1. A brief record of facts, thoughts written down as an aid to memory. Quote, there's time enough, but none to spare, end quote. Charles Chestnut, The Marrow of Tradition. There are all kinds of ordinary notes. There are unreservedly anti-Black notes. There are notes that attempt but fail to undo anti-Black logics. Then there are notes that refuse to accede to the logics that simultaneously re, and unhuman Black people. These Black notes may land in silence or a tone, a sound, a pitch, a record, or an observation made with care. These notes might just reach you across distance, time, and space, and with them you may be held and held. Note 2. In Toni Morrison's Beloved, it is High Man with his high at dawn and the ho when evening came, who takes on the responsibility to interrupt the particular violence of the daily morning rapes, the armed white men's demand for fellatio from one or some or all of the Black men who make up that prison gang in Alfred, Georgia. High Man's daily calls are an interruption, not an end. His morning calls redirect the violence of rape to the violence of other captive labor. To be a Black man and to arrive on the line another morning is to have lived with and through all of these violences. Put another way, High Man's calls do not immediately change the fact of his imprisonment or their own, but they do change the atmosphere. His held note establishes a connection among the men. When the deluge comes that almost kills the Black men locked underground in the mud and water in their cages come graves, locked there by the white men who hold the keys. The trust and care established through High Man's ordinary note provide the means through which Paul D. and the 45 other men held not only in chattel slavery, but also in a prison labor camp, grab onto those 1,000 feet of hand-forged chain, hold on to each other, plunge into, up, out, and through the mud, and escape that prison/grave/ship in Alfred, Georgia. with that note they are held. Note 3, quote, "The past, or more accurately pastness," Michel Roftreau tells us, "is a position," end quote. Several years ago, when we were in Erlangen, Germany, R and I went to the Nazi Documentation Center and Nazi Party rally grounds in Nuremberg. By the time we left, after watching the films and viewing the installations and the displays of photographs, books, racist games, and more, we were convinced that depending on where one stood, this memorialization would actually attract people to Nazism. The objects function as memorabilia, a memorialization not of the wounded, but of the perpetrator. We observed the other people at the center. Some of their faces were filled with admiration for the brutalities of white nationhood and the heraldic cry of white supremacy. They were lit with an emotion that was neither horror at the perpetrators nor sympathy for their victims. The visual and sonic repetitions in the Nazi Documentation Center may now be, or may always have been, incapable of doing the work of quote-unquote never again that in their installation they were intended to do. We saw in them not the condemnation of the Nazis, but their glorification. These displays enter a present in which, quote, "in no way can we identify the past as past," end quote. Note 5. In my memory, there are 2 photographs. The first one is of a white boy shouting. His mouth and face are contorted by what looks like hatred. I don't remember if the target of that hatred was also in the photograph. What I remember is his face and vaguely a dog. The photograph was in a book, part of a photo essay about love overcoming hate. And from the text and context, it's clear that the white boy is angry about Black people. The second photo might also have been in the book. I don't now know for certain. But from the age of 8 or 9 until the book disappeared, I think my mother took the book away, until I was about 11, I would sometimes open it and look at that photo. There was something about that face that I thought I needed to understand. Cloth-bound, hardback, and deep green, the book came from an evangelical Catholic meeting I attended when I spent the weekend with a family named Deckhouse. The organizers of the meeting distributed the book to the overwhelmingly white congregants to instill in them the sinfulness and ugliness of racial and religious hatred. I did not need this lesson. But most of what I remember about that book revolves around the photo of that white boy. His face is an open-mouth rictus of hatred. I felt I knew it. It reminds me now of a young man in a photograph of white supremacists marching on the campus of the University of Virginia in Charlottesville, Virginia, on August 11th, 2017. Reminds me now of the white supremacists who stormed the U.S. Capitol building on January 6th, 2021. The second photograph is famous. When I saw it, I felt that I knew what it was to be the girl at the center of it. So alone and surrounded by hate, I knew her fear. I thought that I saw on the level of her body, her shock or stunnedness in the face of such hatred. It was a kind of composure I could not imagine summoning. I felt the force of that photograph molecularly. The girl in the second photograph is Elizabeth Eckford. When I made this, I forgot to put the second half of the note, so I will go to the next note. Note 6. I find that first photograph completely by chance, not exactly as I have described it. There is no dog, there is a belt, but as soon as I see it, I know it is the photograph from that green fabric-covered book. It's the boy's open mouth. It's that belt wrapped around his hand. It's that rage. And seeing it again, I'm hit with a force of recognition so strong it produces nausea. The caption reads, quote, Youngsters jeer as moving men tote possessions of the Horace Baker family up the steps of their new home in the formerly all-white Del Mar Village development here, 8/30. The Negro family finally gained entrance to their new home after 2 days of demonstrations by whites, end quote. This photograph was taken August 30th, 1963 in Fulcroft, Pennsylvania, 2 years before I was born and 16 miles from where my family lived in a black neighborhood in the majority white suburb of Wayne, Pennsylvania. The boy with the belt wrapped around his hand, I faced that white boy almost every day. So much hatred in that photograph, and they are called youngsters, as if those ecstasies of racial hatred and the confidences of white supremacist violence are simply them practicing their rituals of passage. Note 11, a dictionary suggests itself. Part 2, to make or have the effect of a note. Quote, the archive is meaningful in its context. It is not truth. It belongs to an entire social environment. Françoise Verger. Note 18. I wanted to write about silences and terror and acts that hover over generations, over centuries. I began by writing about my mother and grandmother. Note 23. So there's a section of the notes that really think about memorials and monuments. I'm not reading most of those notes today, but I'm reading some of the notes kind of around them. So note 23. The architecture of the memorial stages encounter. Spectacle is not repair. Note 25. Every memorial and museum to atrocity already contains its failure. Note 25.1. Never again means never again for everyone. In this way, never again has never meant never again. Note 42, a lamentation. In Leon Golub's painting Threnody II, 4 women appear, caught in a dance, active in their postures of grief, prayer, and mourning. In Jacob Lawrence's painting, although the Negro was used to lynching, he found this an opportune time for him to leave where one had occurred. A woman is desolate, slumped over at one end of a table, while at the other end an empty bowl with a spoon in it sits, abandoned. Part 3, can I live? To live in the Black diaspora is, I think, to live as a fiction, a creation of empires and also self-creation. It is to be a being living inside and outside of herself. It is to apprehend the sign one makes, yet to be unable to escape it except in radiant moments of ordinariness made like art. Dion Brand, A Map to the Door of No Return. Note 52, ma'am. Ma'am, a person addressed as ma'am, a married woman, a woman school teacher, U.S., now rare. You know, there are things in Beloved that I've been obsessed with over many years, and one of them, I mean, literally, I've read Beloved like 150 times, and I've probably taught it 120 times. But, you know, there's a, you know, Setha always refers to the older women on the plantation as ma'am. And so one day I decided, let me look up the etymology of ma'am, and that was the etymology. And I think it works in such interesting ways. So, Setha in Beloved is lost in the few memories that she has of her mother before she was tortured and hanged for her part in a revolt on the plantation where they were before Setha was sold to the Garners and Sweet Home. What Setha remembers: a back turned away from her in a field, quote, a circle and a cross burnt right in the skin, end quote, the shape of a hat, a language whose words and meaning she can no longer understand, that she is named after the Black man, the one her mother put her arms around. That if you don't recognize a face, you look for the mark. Setha's mother's knowledge and the knowledge of those other mams, abducted Africans forced over on those slave ships with names like Antelope and the Phyllis and Formiga, and those born into slavery on these quote-unquote New World grounds, counters the racist ledger knowledge of the white man called schoolteacher. Note 64, our joint project. On December 17th, 2012, redacted, a white woman, a professor of French and Italian at Princeton University, wrote an op-ed for the New York Times, Guns and the Decline of the Young Man. The titular young man is white, and when Redacted published this opinion, it was 3 days after Redacted's December 14th, 2012 massacre of 26 people, 20 of whom were children between the ages of 6 and 7 in Newtown, Connecticut, in the United States. Redacted wrote, quote, "They were once our heroes, our young and shining fathers, our sweet brothers, our tireless athletes, our fearless warriors, the brains of our institutions, the makers of our wares, the movers of our world," end quote. She continued, quote, "I would argue that maleness and whiteness are commodities in decline. And while those of us who are not male or white have enjoyed some benefits from their decline, the sort of violence and murder that took place at Sandy Hook Elementary will continue to occur if we do not find a way to carry them along with us in our successes rather than leaving them behind," end quote. What a use of the word our. Imagine writing this after those murders of 21st grade children. Imagine inhabiting such melancholy for an ascendant white supremacy. Imagine such certainty that this is to be our joint project and that its continuance and not its destruction is for our good. Note 69. So this is a copy of James Baldwin's The Evidence of Things Not Seen that was given to me by my mother, and the inscription reads, "To Tina B., Christina Elizabeth, Tina Beth, Tina B." You see how it, "To Tina B. with love from Mom." Note 69. Open any book that my mother and I gifted each other, or that she gifted any of her children, or that we gifted her and each other, and you will find an inscription. We had an elaborate language of book giving. And this is my brother Stephen gave our mother a copy of a book called Dark Symphony, which was a collection of Negro writings. So happy birthday to Mommy. Love, Stephen. March 2nd, 1970. Part 4. To consider or study carefully. I've thought a lot over the years about the astonishing gift double consciousness is. The ability to be alien to oneself is a good thing, not a bad thing, to be cherished rather than mourned. Ruth Wilson Gilmore. Note 80, a moment of pure tenderness. I'm in the shops at Columbus Circle in Manhattan on the up escalator, and the woman and the girl are on the down escalator. The girl is about 12, the woman in her late 40s. The girl is 2 steps in front of the woman, and as the girl looks back and up at her, the woman reaches out and touches her face. The look on the woman's face and the way that their bodies settle into the afterlife of this touch makes it seem to me that what I have witnessed is a moment of pure tenderness. All of my desires to see my mother again lodge there. I'm on the Bloor Street line in Toronto, heading home from teaching. It's a November day, mid-afternoon, and unseasonably warm. The train is stopped at Finch West Station, and when I look out of the window, I see a little girl around 8 or 9 years old. She's walking with a woman and a boy who appears to be slightly older than she. The girl leans forward as she walks, and the strap of her school bag is slung across her forehead. You know, you've seen that, like little kids just sling the school bag across their head and walk with it. And the bag's hanging down her back, and I look at this and I think, wow, this tenderness in what I've seen. Part 5, Lucida. In the context of such enormous structural violence, how was it possible to imagine that a beautiful life is possible? Even more unthinkable was the idea that one might create it, not in the future, but now. Saidiya Hartman, interview with Rizvana Bradley. Note 110. It begins with a photograph, and this is a photograph of my mother in 1927. It's uncanny because my mother doesn't yet look like my mother, and my grandmother, who I never met, looks almost exactly like who my mother will become. These particular photographs are of my mother's face, her hands, her books, her needlework. My camera lucida is saturated with my seeing and my mother's care in the noise of structural precarity. It is 1928. In the photograph, my mother is 5 years old, and she's dressed for Halloween. The photographer was her stepfather, and it's my mother's hands in the photograph that constitute what Roland Barthes called the punctum, that detail, quote, that accident which pricks me but also bruises me is poignant to me, end quote. Note 115. In that Halloween photograph of my mother and her mother, my grandmother has been interrupted. Her husband Joseph has called her away from cleaning or cooking or sewing in order to have their picture taken. She would have told him that she wasn't presentable, that she was busy, that she was wearing her house dress, that her hair was a mess, but he would have persisted, my mother said, calling her by his nickname for her, cajoling her, and my grandmother would relent, step away from her work, and come and sit before his camera. There's a visual echo in the photograph, some correspondence between my mother's hands, her headdress and wig, and the hand-pinked gross-grain ribbon that edges the deep V front of her dress, her long beaded necklace, and then the pattern of what looked like mended tears in the skirt of her mother's dress. My grandmother sewed the costume that my mother is wearing. There's more than one detail in this photograph that compels and arrests me. There's more than one detail that produces in me a feeling of great tenderness. My mother's hands are one. The holes in my grandmother's dress are another. Her shoes, another still. Note 116. How do they arrest me? There is something in me like wonder that they existed against the period in which this photograph was taken, existed against race riots, lynchings, segregation, little or no work, poor housing, the prison, and every other form of violence and privation. They are managing to come through, and I measure their presence as a surprise even as I exist. My mother survives to become my mother. Then I arrive. Note 117. My mother's hands were elegant even as a child, the same elegance that I remark on in Our Future Time and that she laughingly shrugs off, even though she knows this to be true. My mother actually loved her hands. And even as she loves what they make, the shapes they trace in the air when she speaks, and then again when she is still and listening, quote, her hand leafs through the grained air, end quote. Note 118, an eruption of tenderness. In that photograph from 1928, my grandmother's clothing, hair, and facial expressions signal some exhaustion, but her body, alert to the expectations of photography, assumes a particular position that might be called feminine. Though she does not look directly at the camera, her legs are together and slightly angled, her ankles crossed, elegant. My grandmother appears here in one of the only ways that I know her, she whom I met primarily through my mother's stories of her in which she came to life. My mother's eyes are searching and serious, too serious for the occasion of the photograph, which is Halloween. The somber look on her face pierces me. So too do the wig and the crown that she wears, her hands. My mother leans into her mother's body. One hand rests on her mother's thigh, uncertain, testing her weight. The darned holes in my grandmother's dress hobble the appearance of her knees. Note 125. Roy DeCarava's The Sound I Saw, a book of photographs and text, is filled with everything. DeCarava works blackness and photography from a place that is deeply knowing about the tyranny of photography, and where all around him that tyranny is obvious. He manages, though, to give us shadow and light, texture and vibration. He shows blackness in all of its shade and depth and glow, and all of its, quote, lush tonalities. The black figures in his photographs, some of which you saw earlier in that beautiful conversation between Laurent and Daoud, the black figures in his photographs appear as if they are lit from within. They direct his photographs with their gesture, their look, and their deep concentration in whatever elegance, charm, gesture, in whatever living they're in. DeCarava's look, close or at a distance, does not seem to intrude. It is always tender, an invitation to tarry, interested and filled with regard. Daoud Bey also has this look, which is part of a genre of black looking. We see it in the series of 25 large-scale portraits that comprise his Night Coming Tenderly Black. This set of photographs, like this one, untitled 4, Leaves and Porch, reference but do not contain the body. They are filled instead with the after-image of those enslaved people who passed by there on their way to something like freedom. Filled with the presence of the black people who walked or ran or hid nearby those trees, that water, this structure. Just as I can see the labor of the musicians or the coal cellar and hear the laughter of the children in DeCarava's photographs, I can hear the breathing in these photographs. I can see those ghosted figures, even as these photos might appear to some other gaze as altogether emptied of the body. I can see the light in these photos so filled with black flight. Note 125.1, Evergreen. I'm watching Evergreen, installed in the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts as part of Daoud Bey's breathtaking and breath-giving elegy. Slowly we move through the grounds of the plantation, such lush greens everywhere, so much terrible beauty. Transfixed, I watch the middle screen as the camera pans out. And what one might think at first is one extant slave quarter becomes one after the other after the other. 2 rows of them facing each other across a path. When I see this, my breath catches, and I think. When I see this, I feel. When I see this, I know what Setha meant when talking about Sweet Home. She tells Denver, quote, "You can't never go there," end quote. Even if the whole farm, every tree and grass blade of it dies, the picture is still there. And what's more, if you go there, you who never was there, if you go there and stand in the place where it was, it will happen again. It will be there for you, waiting for you. So Denver, you can't never go there, never, because even though it's all over and done with, it's going to always be there, waiting for you. But also, as Daoud has told us, and as we know, that there is also everywhere. And so we do go there, and we do meet those spaces and those places, and we do walk those sites, and we do commune with those ancestors. Note 125.2, Stony the Road. And this is a little part of the essay that I wrote for the catalog. The object photographs in Stony the Road are taken on the Richmond Slave Trail. And although I've been to Richmond, Virginia several times and to Shockoe Bottom, I had never been there. 3 miles long it remains, depending on where you enter the trail, a largely unmarked path. It's along this very path that from the 17th century to the 19th century, 350,000 or more captive Africans walked after being taken off of those ships, after making that long and horrifying voyage across the Atlantic. Those Africans moved from one terror to another terror, the terror of the capture, the terror of the march in the barracoon, the terror of the holding and the allotted inches of the hold, of the violence, the stench, the unbearable stench, and heat and suffering. How long would it take for the stench of the slave ship to leave them? Then the terrors of the offloading, then the terrors of the forced walking after being on board a slave ship, on board a ship, lying on a board, horizontal with only inches to move in for months on end. Those Africans would have had limited vertical time. There is horizontal time and there is vertical time. How hard would walking be after this torturous crossing? How hard would being on solid ground be? Welcome, hard. The body would still keep the motion of the ship. I wonder how long that swaying would last. Those captive Africans would be swaying and stumbling as they walked, as much from the unfamiliar lack of movement, a surface that is steady and not continuously moving, as from the chains around their ankles, the chains that bind them one to the other. How difficult to walk chained to another person, to other persons. They would have had to find or make a rhythm that allows for movement together. Who immediately dropped down to the earth? Who needed help to disembark? Who was past help? Who stumbled, breathing hard because the air was fresh and they wanted to take whole lungfuls of it? You know, they said that you could smell a slave ship coming from more than a mile away. Sharks followed in the wake of those ships. Fresh air would have been sorely lacking. Do you think that being on land was as much torture to those Africans as it was respite? Note 127. In Montgomery, Alabama, at the Legacy Museum, and this is about the Legacy Museum for slavery and mass incarceration, from slavery to mass incarceration. I watch as people, I don't think this even exists anymore. I haven't been there since 2018, but I understand that there's a new building, and I think that the photo booth is no longer there. But there used to be a photo booth. So, in Montgomery, Alabama, at the Legacy Museum, I watch as people enter the photo booth to have their photograph taken. So you go through the from slavery to mass incarceration, and then there's a photo booth that you might or might not enter. So you must, to get your picture taken, you must choose a background image and then enter an email address in order to have the photo mailed to yourself. Several people go through this process. Each one chooses the background of jars that hold soil that have been gathered with care from the sites where Black people were lynched. I watch a young white woman enter the booth. She takes her picture, then she looks at the possible choices: the front of the museum, the jars of soil, the wall of racist signs. And twice she makes a choice, and then she deletes the photo. She goes through this process a total of 3 times. On the 3rd try, she leaves the booth. Her photo remains up on the screen, and she tells the people waiting in line, never mind, just please just delete it. And something about this encounter, something about seeing her struggle and her eventual refusal feels appropriate to the weight of this history. Part 6, preliminary entries. Oh, did I just see a sign? I did, okay. Uh-oh. Okay, I'm getting there. Part 6, preliminary entries toward a dictionary of untranslatable Blackness. See, I caught it peripherally. No, it's probably about 7 more minutes. Note 174, liquidity. What kind of expansion can a painting hold? Can it bring into our senses how encounters become scale and refusals textured? Becoming and being Black is movement, state change, evolution, quanta, and distance. Black distance is a form of knowledge indelibly tied to liquid. We know who we are as a discontinuous expansion of blue-black. What are the spatial dependencies of curvilinear liberation? How does distance influence compositions made from an ocean rising? The cantilever of black sensoria is the whole ethos, a mark, a line, an enclosure, an edge. Freedom is composing a painting with precarity that keeps blackness close, over, across, and under the edge of being. Torkwase Dyson. Note 175, tenderness. Tenderness just might be a gesture. It might just be a look, a black look, some regard, relayed between people in peril. Note 177, breathing, collective noun, a multitude of black persons gathered, a breathing. I'm going to skip some. Excuse me 1 second. One sec. Note 169, tender. When Claudia Tate interviewed Gail Jones for Black American Literature Forum, she asked, quote, "Do you have any theories about the human condition that you dramatize in your work?" To which Jones replied, "I think that what comes out in my work in these particular novels, Corregidora and Eva's Man, is an emphasis on brutality. But I think that something else is also suggested in them, namely the alternative to brutality, which is tenderness. Although the main focus is on the blues relationships or relationships involving brutality, there seems to be a growing understanding working itself out, especially in Corregidora, of what is required in order to be genuinely tender. Perhaps brutality enables one to recognize what tenderness is," end quote. Tender. The girl who wrote on the chalkboard. The boy who was carrying Skittles and iced tea. The girl who was by herself and surrounded by hate. The young woman who was asleep in her bed. The young woman who drove the wrong way, and the baby girl who survived this. The man who cried for his mother. The girl who took the video of the man who cried for his mother. The other girl, the cousin of the first girl, who also witnessed this. The boy who was skipping away. The woman convulsed with mourning, and the woman who warned them not to take her picture. The girl who told her mother that she would take care of her. The boy who had only just arrived at the gazebo to play. The girl who was sound asleep in her grandmother's living room. The girl to whose forehead someone taped the word ship. The woman who questioned why she was being stopped. The woman pulled over with her 3 young children in the car. The woman who knocked on a door and asked for help. The boy who was walking down the street. The woman whose 2 little sons were swept away in a flood, the door to their safety barred. The man who was running down the street. The boy who was playing music in his car with his friends. The boy whose mother was anxious when he did not return home. The woman who fell. The girl who called for help. The man who yelled, "Mom, Mom." The man who said, "I can't breathe." The boy accused of shoplifting and his mother whose heart was broken. The man who said, "I'm scared." The girls, sisters, whose bones became lessons. The girl who emerged from the rubble and asked, "Are you taking me to the cemetery?" The doctors, nurses, medics, and ambulance drivers working without bandages, without anesthesia, without safety. The woman who called 911 for help. The children who held a press conference in English and said, "We want to live." The boy who asked, "Am I dead?" The girl who said, "I am a child." Note 234. Care is complicated, gendered, misused. It often It is often mobilized to enact violence, not assuage it, and yet I cannot surrender it. I want acts and accounts of care as shared and distributed risk, as mass refusals of the unbearable life, as total rejections of the dead future. Note 246. What is required of us now in this long time of our undoing? Thank you.